Today we are going to speak of prehistorical freedom. What is freedom for prehistorical hominins? I'm going to concentrate my attention on a newly discovered hominin species, which is in this book, Cave of Bones, explained since the discovery, since it was discovered in 2013 and has been little by little excavated and explored in underground caves in South Africa. Since the discovery in 2013 by Lee Berger and John Hawkes, working for the National Geographic, questions have been brought up by this discovery as for the hominin family and as for the Homo genus, and also, of course, as for Homo sapiens. Homo Naledi has been situated in time between 335,000 BCE and 235,000 BCE. When you know that Homo sapiens has been situated in time at the most around 300,000 BCE, most of archaeologists and anthropologists don't go beyond 250,000 BCE. This new Homo Naledi is more or less overlapping, at least a little bit, with Homo sapiens, or a Homo sapien that is emerging in South Africa. The physical characteristics of this new species is, first of all, that it is small, less than 150 centimeters tall. It has a small brain, says Lee Berger. We're going to discuss it in a minute. It is perfectly adapted for climbing, having long big toes and having longer thumbs than Homo sapiens, for instance. It is also endowed with a pelvis as a trunk, which is a typical sign of a species that is bipedal, walking, maybe running. It has long legs, which also goes in the direction of maybe running. It has human-shaped feet. That's not enough, but that's what Lee Berger says, and he gives a picture which is not conclusive. Has Homo Naledi the arch feet of Homo sapiens? This is important, the arch of the feet of that new species. According to the level of arch we can say, or we can deduct, the type of running that is doing. It is more arced if you are doing long distance running than if you are only doing short distance running or occasional running. Next characteristic is that his hands have a grasping thumb. I said that when I said that he was adapted for climbing. The thumb is longer than necessary to grasp better branches, maybe for trees, but also, since he is living in caves, stones that are enabling him to go down into the caves. which are actually, the caves are the rising star cave system, which are very difficult to enter and penetrate. And for a last characteristic that Lee Berger proposes is that he has small human-sized teeth, and there, that's human size is going to bring me back to the small brain. Lee Berger doesn't know what is encephalization quotient, EQ in short. He doesn't know at all, doesn't refer to it and doesn't use it. I've been using it for at least 15 years because Neanderthal has a bigger brain than Homo sapiens, but if you take the EQ quotient um, in the calculation, you find out that in fact he has an 11% deficit as for size of the brain. What is the EQ factor? It is considering that the brain is bigger if the mass of the body is bigger. The bigger the mass of the body, the bigger the brain, which means that Mr. Neanderthal, being extremely massive as for the body mass, he has a disadvantage with his maybe bigger brain, but when compared with Homo sapiens, he has a deficit. He should be even bigger as for the brain. And it's the same characteristic you're going to use, or I'm going to use, with Homo Naledi. If we consider that the size, the height, on average height of Homo Naledi is 143.6 centimeters, as compared to the average size of Homo sapiens right now, which is 177.4 centimeters, you find out that if you calculate the proportion between the two heights, you find a quotient of 1.23. Is that the proper EQ? We are only taking into account the height, not the mass. If we take the mass of the body, that's a weight, and there the difference is quite different. The weight, average weight of Homo naledi is 39.7 kilograms, and the average mass of Homo sapiens, I've taken an American Caucasian right now, is 89.6 kilograms. That's a difference, a proportion that is 2.25. If you use that factor and recalculate the size of the brain, the maximum size of the brain is calculated by Lee Berger as being 610 cubic centimeters. You multiply it by 2.25 and you get 1372.5 cubic centimeters, as compared to the size of the brain of Homo sapiens, which is between 1270 cubic centimeters and 1330 cubic centimeters. It is even bigger than the biggest Homo sapiens size, brain size. So the argument of he has a small brain, so is less developed than Homo sapiens, goes down the chute because of this calculation. And the EQ factor is standard at the present moment in archaeology, anthropology, and of course in biology. Then what is important, you see, that's the first element that you have to calculate. I'm not going to take all the characteristics one after the other. We shift to the other question, which is most important, the cultural element, or the cultural development of Homo Naledi. The first element that was discovered by Lieberger in his exploration of those caves, he found something that looked bizarre when they were just digging. Uh, it looked as if it had been worked upon, moved. They had a body there, or skeleton, and that skeleton didn't seem to be just dropped on the ground, but seemed to have been put into the ground. The ground seemed to have been worked upon, and excavators some to put the body in it and covered up. Uh, he says when he saw that from outside, hadn't gone down yet. He said to his team, the people who were working there, "You stop excavating, and we're going to look into it a little bit more." And he found out, yes, it is suspicious. That is, we can believe it is a burial. Then, how can you explore, if I can say so, a burial without destroying it? So they decided to use a technique which is quite difficult to implement, but which is possible, to excavate the whole block in which that skeleton was positioned, and to extract the whole block and then scan the whole block without excavating the bones. And there, the discovery is that the skeleton on top that they had seen as must have been buried, there were 3 more skeletons under, which means that first it took a long time, it covered a long period of time since there were older burials under the top one. How far does it go? We don't know. Actually, it's difficult to measure because there is very little standard carbon down there to be able to measure the time, the period when those bones were buried. But for sure, under the top one, which is considered as being a teenager, which means that in those times with our hominian species, you were an adult at the age of 13. So teenager doesn't mean anything in archaeology at that period. 13, you were an adult because you were entering procreating, and that was extremely important. So, young adult, would I say? Under that young adult, there was one that was younger, then we can probably say child, or older child if you want, and there's younger, so older child, and then there was another one that was older, so frankly an adult, under the top one. And they discovered by scanning it properly that there were in some kind of a corner on the side of that block, there were fragile, immature bones, which means that there was a child, there was an infant, and maybe even a fetus that was miscarried or stillborn that was buried there. They should have brought a question, an important question, but Lieberger doesn't even hint at the problem. What was the position of women as mothers in those burials, and if the skeletons were actually buried in the ground, I mean that there must have been a ritual. What was the position of the mother in the ritualistic procedure? That is never asked by Lieberger, and that is a shortcoming. But if you go on like that, you find out that there are elements that should have brought some kind of thinking on the side of Lieberger. Just over that grave, on the rock face over the grave, there he found some strange design. I just give you a picture of it. If you can see it, I hope you can. That's what I call a hashtag. That is more or less called a hashtag in archaeology. We are, remember, somewhere around 300,000 years before Christ. That's the oldest engraving of that type that we know. There's another one around 100,000 years before Christ, which is attributed to Neanderthals in Gibraltar. You see at once there are 200,000 years between this one and the one in Gibraltar, which is very, very extremely similar, and 200,000 years between the two, and something like several thousand kilometers between the two. Which means that, of course, either a Neanderthal discovered the hashtag created by Naledi, and I doubt it very much, because he would never have been able to go down those caves, because to go down to that particular spot in the caves, you need to be or to have the physique of Mr. Naledi. That is very small in many ways. Neanderthal is massive. He would never have been able to copy, and that would have been a very important intellectual property crime. But never mind, he didn't copy, and he was too far away anyway, and he was in Gibraltar, that is, not even in Africa. So, we have to say that Naledi produced it. How? At once, the question of the tools comes up. The rock in those caves is extremely hard, so they must have had a stone tool made from a stone that was harder than the rock of the cave. Which means that, no, they couldn't find it in the cave themselves. They have to find that tool somewhere else and bring it in. Very hard rock means long work. Long work. And that doesn't mean it was done in 2 hours or 3 hours, in the dark, in the complete darkness of the cave. So, first thing, the tools. Bizarre, because those tools are also attributed to more advanced hominins. At the very most, Neanderthal had probably some tools or weapons or defensive weapons, but those kind of tools to engrave something in the rock are typical of Homo sapiens, or that level of development. That's the first thing. Second thing, in the darkness. So he had to have some light. Had to have some light, which means they had to bring torches. And actually, Lieberger found out soot in the roofs or on the roofs of the various caves, and he found next to that grave something that looks like a little fire with ashes, and in another section of the cave he found what he calls a hearth that is stones piled up in such a way that you could burn wood there and you could actually cook something. And he found around this hearth burnt bones of animals, not of human beings, but animals, small animals that were not small animals living underground, but small animal livings on the surface, which means that Naledi got out of the caves from time to time to go hunting. The small animals, which means probably using traps or technique that didn't require long distance running, they were not antelope, but that is not explored because it means that he was a hunter. They couldn't hunt down ground or in those caves, they were absolutely empty. So he had to hunt on the surface. Then what kind of hunting did he practice? We have nothing about Naledi on the surface, exclusively in the caves. That is a real problem. And there is a last problem. When you engrave something on top of a grave, of a tomb, of a burial, of a buried body, why it is a long process for one, but then you repeat in your mind and even you speak out a certain number of elements, like the name of the person, like some kind of ritualistic formula to accompany him into the grave and into the inscription, because the inscription is going to be, and Lieberger brings some elements proving that it was done, that was performed, is going to be read by the fingers of the visitors. They're going to recognize the inscription and they're going to recite what the inscription is standing for, the name of the person, what kind of a man or woman or child he was, and so on and so on. Ritualistic formulas. It's very easy to think that we are at a level of development that is a lot higher than pre-sapiens development. Because those elements I'm saying are typically sapiens. And not necessarily advanced sapiens, but definitely developed sapiens, that is probably before their migrations out of Africa. And anyway, we are in Africa, so we are before the migration of Homo sapiens out of black Africa. So those questions should have been brought up by Lieberger, but he didn't. And that's a little bit a shame, because that would have improved his reasoning about the cultural level of Naledi. If you're gone with that, I've said that he used fire to cook animals, so it's not any kind of use of fire. It is a very utilitarian way of using fire to cook meat, maybe vegetables, how we don't exactly know, but probably by grilling, which is a very standard way of doing it. Then the next element that he brings up is that in the first grave I was speaking of, the body on top was so what he called a child, which is in fact a young adult, a teenager and not a child. So for those people in those days, a young adult. Next to one of his hands there is a stone that is not worked upon, I mean cut and polished or whatever, but a stone that has a shape of what could be a tool, chosen maybe because of that shape. It's next to the hand of the buried person. is it a burial good, or is it a tool that a person used? We don't know, but it is bringing up questions. If they had tools, they were not that pre-sapiens, they were actually coming close to sapiens. But that is a kind of question that has to be asked seriously. Finally, so the engraving, if we compare it to the one by Neanderthal in Gorham Cave in Gibraltar, we have the same kind, absolutely similar type of hashtag engraving. But in the three walls of the main burial chamber of Mr. Naledi, there are other elements engraved, what Berger calls triangles, squares, and other geometric figures. For Naledi, we have absolutely no right to say that they knew what a triangle was or a square was. And even better, one of the things he identifies is something that looks like a capital A. Obviously, there we are burning stages. We can't say that Naledi knew what a capital A was, except that two lines joined into an angle and a third line crossing the two. Of course that looks like, but that looks like for us, not for Mr. Naledi, because he didn't know what a capital A was. But anyway, those, and that's very important, those shapes, geometric shapes that are engraved on three walls of four of the main burial chamber, those shapes, you find them in Neanderthal times next to the hashtag in Gibraltar, but you find them systematically in the cave paintings of Homo sapiens all over Europe and all over Indonesia, but at a date around 45,000 before Christ at the earliest, and spreading over 20 or 30,000 years. Those shapes are not natural. They hardly exist in nature. Or if they exist in nature, Mr. Naledi has abstracted them, which means that he has a level of discrimination that is by far a simple discrimination, animal discrimination, to register in your brain in brain-machine code something that will enable that animal to recognize, to remember, and so on, the things that he is, or he crosses when moving in nature. That's one thing. But where are those shapes coming from? How can those hominins, pre-sapiens hominins, even very close to sapiens, how can sapiens himself identify those, recognize those, isolate, discriminate those shapes, and reproduce them over and over and over again in their cave engravings for Naledi or for Neanderthal, but very marginal for Neanderthal, and in the cave paintings of Homo sapiens. The idea, there's an allusion too, of course, Geneviève van Petzinger, who is the first person who actually collected those signs in all the caves in Europe and Indonesia, and found out that there were about 32, maybe a few more, because since then a few more have been added, figures that were the same in practically all the caves, no matter where, no matter when. Where are they coming from? And thus, her hypothesis is that they are optics. And optics, that is, optical shapes that are engraved in the central nervous system, that includes the eyes and the brain and all the other senses, but there we are visual, so the eyes are essential, and registered there architecturally. That is, it comes from the architecture of the central nervous system that literally produces those shapes, and human beings or hominins who have those shapes in their eyes are just reproducing them outside in a visual way to engrave them in stone or to paint them on stone. And that is an interesting hypothesis that Lee Berger doesn't really explore enough, because that shows that what the various hominins are going to produce in a more advanced form with Homo sapiens is not coming from nowhere. And it is not imagination, and it is not some kind of free devising. It is coming from something that is inside the body, that is produced by the body, as many other things are produced by the body. There it is visual shapes, but then all the movements of your hands and your legs and so on are produced by the body. The beating of your heart is produced by the body. We don't consider that human beings or hominins learned how to make their heart beat. That would be a little bit ridiculous. And at the same time, so that those entoptics forms and shapes would come from the architecture of the general central nervous system. That is an interesting idea that should have been pushed a lot, because at this moment we come to a simple conclusion. Homo Naledi had reached the symbolical level of mental development. He was able to produce shapes coming from his entoptics inner consciousness, if you can say that, and he was developing new shapes, the hashtags, from maybe not scratch, but as representing what he was saying while he was engraving them, what the people will be or would be saying when visiting the grave and touching the inscription, the engraving, the ritualistic formula used when the body was buried, and elements like that. That is shifting from oral language, and obviously Naledi had some oral language. What level, we don't know. and it is difficult to know, but it is oral and articulated enough to more or less incite human beings to transfer them from a purely oral form into a visual form, the hashtag. And that is important because first the language of Naledi must have been articulated up to what level, that has to be determined by researchers, particularly phylogenic linguists, which are rarely taken into account in those fields. And second, the ritualistic use of that language is a symbolical activity which is preceding any kind of visual symbol, but which is part of language itself. By definition, language is symbolical. And then the third one, when you get into a visual transfer or transferring form to represent that oral formula, ritualistic formula, you are on the verge of inventing writing. It is the first form of writing. Non-representational, but a transference from oral language to some kind of written shape, form. And that is a real revolution. Because Naledi did that 200,000 years before Homo sapiens. And even nearly 200,000 years before Neanderthal. It's the oldest, so far, that we know, the oldest hashtag form of that type discovered in the world as a production of a hominin person, which is not supposed to be Homo sapiens, and as for the timeline, it will be a very precocious Homo sapiens. Pre-Homo sapiens, what level? Those questions are on the table. What is the freedom of Naledi when he does that? Does he consider that it is his freedom to bury the dead? Does he consider that it is his freedom to inscribe a hashtag formula over the grave of the buried person? Is the question of freedom a real question? Personally, I wouldn't say that freedom is the most important question, but I would say, what is the use of all that? What is Homo Naledi using his language, no matter what level, to bury people and to inscribe over the tomb some kind of formula that is, of course, oral first of all, and repeated over and over again, why the engraving is taking place, why the burying is taking place, why the visiting of the burial is taking place. And that is a real question. Can we speak of freedom for this hominin, or is it a necessity, a practical use? That we of course cannot know, and it's probably a little bit of everything. There must be some kind of freedom. Is it someone who invented that kind of thing, or is it a collective invention? Invention is maybe not the proper word. Development, probably. That, again, we can't know. Because the inscription, the hashtag, that must have taken several weeks to be achieved, completed, and hard work, what's more, might not have been by one person, might have been done by several people, working together or working one after the other, one making one line, another one making a second line, and the third one making a crossing line, and so on. But we don't know. And it's very difficult at the present moment to know, since we can't even properly date those elements. New techniques are appearing, and pretty soon we'll be able to date those elements accurately, and we might discover that they're even older than we think. But that was all. So Mr. Naledi is probably a very pre-sapiens person, very important pre-sapiens person, that might have taken or played a role in the emergence of Homo sapiens in South Africa, in Black Africa. What role, what was the connection with Naledi and Homo sapiens? We don't know. We might be able to find out when the DNA of Naledi is identified. So far, they haven't found any way to analyze the DNA of Homo sapiens, of Naledi. So that's not easy. But that's what research is all about. We never have the answers, we only have the questions. And we live with the questions, and we are satisfied with the answers we construct little by little in at times long research, the answers that are supposed to clarify the questions more than solve the problem that the question is bringing up. Clarify the questions so that the questions are better worded, better understood, and we can advance, go on in the research. So that we do for today. So have a good day and bye bye.